I've got Andy Blow from Precision Hydration and Fuel joining me today.
Good to see you, Scott, as always.
Good to see you, mate. Today, I think will be a really interesting talk for a lot of people for a lot of practical reasons. We're obviously touching on pre-fueling hydration, pre-fueling and hydration, and whether it's worth the hassle for the athletes out there. I think it's very topical at the moment. A lot of people are talking about carbohydrates and a lot of people are talking about sodium. So I think, Andy, you at the helm of a fantastic company of Precision Hydration and Fuel. I think it's a very timely conversation that we had, and very interested to hear what your practical experience has been from a company perspective and also from all the athletes that you're working with. And I'll just chime in here and there.
Sounds good.
Okay. So I'll just introduce myself. My name's Scott Tyndall. I'm co-founder of Fuelin, which is the world's first training-based nutrition app. This means that it syncs directly with your coach's training plan. So Training Peaks, today's plan, or Final Surge, if you have a program, a coaching program delivered through one of those platforms, we sync directly with that and then provide you with a personalized nutrition program, which means that every meal before, during, and after every session related to the intensity and the duration of those sessions is covered. So whatever your purpose is, whether you're a triathlete, short course, long course, marathon runner, or cyclist, we have you covered.
Good stuff. Yeah. As Scott said, my name's Andy. I'm one of the founders of Precision Fuel and Hydration, and we basically specialize in helping athletes to individualize their fuel and hydration for maximum performance. Although we work predominantly with endurance athletes, we work across a range of sports, and as well as having hydration and fueling products, electrolyte products and carbohydrate products, we have things like sweat tests and educational tools and resources to help people get the best out of their fueling and hydration so they can perform at the top level.
Perfect. So look, without further ado, we're going to get into carb loading. I just said carb loading 101. So we're going to go through what it is, the basics of it, pros and cons, and some of the science. We'll go into pre-hydration, and then we'll have a chat about hyperhydration, and those two will blend into each other. So carb loading 101, it's pretty well known. Andy, what's in terms of carb loading, what is it?
Well, I think carb loading is something that probably hasn't changed a lot in quite a number of years now, unlike a lot of other areas of nutrition science for performance. I remember when I was competing seriously in the 1990s and the early 2000s, the carbohydrate loading advice was kind of getting towards the point where where it still is now. So although before that, the research on carb loading started really in the sort of 60s and 70s, and it went through some different phases. There used to be a lot of talk about having to deplete your glycogen stores, for example, before you carb loaded. By the time I was sort of, doing my sports science degree and actually competing as an athlete, it was fairly well established that actually you didn't need to deplete, that carb loading was all about eating quite a lot more carbohydrate in the last 2 or 3 days before a competition or a really hard training session. And the key aim of it was to stock and super compensate your muscle glycogen stores. So if you were racing a short race, then you would really be able to maximize your power output. And if you were racing a very long race, it would enable you to have as much fuel on board as possible so that you could go for as hard as you could for as long as you could. I certainly think that it was something that I did a lot of things wrong as a young athlete, but I do feel like this is an area that I tended to nail it and get it right. And still now, though, see a lot of athletes not quite understand the nuances of it. I think most athletes understand the overview of carb loading. It's kind of, they get the concept, but what they then do is have a bowl or two of extra pasta here and there. And I'm sure you'll have something to say on this, Scott, but it's a bit more detailed than that. It actually surprises people sometimes just how much carbohydrate you've got to take in to properly load.
Yeah. So if we said the basics are that it's taking in a fairly large amount of carbohydrates, Most of those carbohydrates are going to be in what most people would think of as bad carbohydrates. They're probably going to be quite refined and quite processed, firstly to reduce fiber content, but also to allow the athlete to get that amount in. If we said timing wise, 48 to 24 hours beforehand, minimum of 24 hours, probably up to 48 hours, you could do it. In terms of the benefits, you outline some of those. So we're talking about supracompensation of glycogen. So my understanding is around, you can increase glycogen content in muscle, but also liver by up to 200% by carbohydrate loading. Is that how you tend to think about it or explain it to athletes?
Yeah, I think it's usually 150% is the sort of figure that I tend to quote from some of the literature, but I know that there are studies that have shown greater gains than that. So whatever it is, it's a lot more than what you're normally walking around within your muscles and your liver, that's for sure. Okay,
and the benefits of that, as you described, I think you described pretty easily. Look, ultimately, it's going to provide you with more energy, more glycogen, more energy, more power, more speed. Pretty simple. So I don't think there's any I don't think the benefits are fairly clearly outlined. In terms of drawbacks, what have you seen in the past? And I think you touched on some of them in terms of the athlete knowledge.
Yeah, I think some of the drawbacks would be things like GI problems or just feeling bloated and feeling sluggish and heavy if you're not used to it, or if you don't get it quite right, if you don't get the timing of it right, the amount of it right, if you don't change what you're eating. You touched on a really important point, that carb loading, when you lay out the food on a table for carb loading, it looks like a really unhealthy diet, and that sometimes doesn't sit well with athletes who as a group want to eat more healthy, nutritious, fibrous, natural foods. We talk about carb loading is like white processed foods. It's foods that, if anyone's got toddlers or young kids, it's foods that they gravitate towards, breakfast cereals and white bagels and bread and that kind of thing. And so I suppose that not necessarily, if you do it right, I genuinely don't think there are any drawbacks to carbohydrate loading. I think there's only positives, but the drawbacks are more in if you sort of miss the mark with what you're doing, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say one of the drawbacks, which is probably more psychological, it might be the weight gain that some athletes associate with carbohydrate loading, which is probably why I suggest to them not to jump on the scales the day before or the day of the race, because sometimes that can be a psychological blow to them. However, as I explained to them, is they've got more water in them. They're probably hyperhydrated, or at least well hydrated. And that's ultimately, you say to them, well, what do you want to avoid during the race? And they're like, well, getting dehydrated. And you're like, okay, well, then there's nothing to worry about. So I think you can flip that drawback pretty quickly. It's usually just the actual number on the scale that tends to freak out some athletes. And I think just explaining that, so for every gram of carbohydrates, you'll attract somewhere between 3 and 4 grams of water. So if you are carbohydrate loading and drinking fluids to stay hydrated, then it is very likely you will gain weight, but that weight won't be, fat or anything like that. It is just water weight. I put in the bit about multiple transportable carbs. Do you tend to recommend, multiple forms of carbohydrates with the carbohydrate loading to your athletes?
I think that's sort of less important in carb loading than it is in carbohydrate that you're going to ingest when you're exercising, because the rate of absorption, you can spread your carbohydrate intake out over a couple of days, so it doesn't matter quite as much. I do know that a lot of athletes like to carb load with things like honey, which are high in fructose, or use that as part of it. And I do sort of sense there might be a benefit of that on the morning of a race, when the carb loading that you do in the days prior is primarily to load up your muscles, and the carb load that you do on the morning of a race is often a top up for your liver glycogen, and obviously fructose gets processed through the liver, so using a little bit more fructose in that period is probably not a bad thing. But honestly, I think the multi-transportable carb thing really comes into play a lot more when you're you're eating during exercise rather than in the build-up. As long as you're getting the carbohydrate volumes per grams per kilo, which we'll talk about in a minute, about right, then it doesn't matter too much what those sources are.
Yeah, I agree. I think when we talk about using fructose during the week and things like that, it's for trying to get as rapid replenishment of the liver glycogen as possible. And that's certainly, if they've got back-to-back sessions or big sessions and they need to try and replenish within 24 hours, then, getting that fructose in. But as you say, I think in the case of a structured carbohydrate load, yes, it's probably makes sense to have combination of glucose, maltodextrin, fructose and whatnot, because that's probably just going to happen in the practicalities of eating this amount of food. But I think in terms of the multiple transportable carbs for rapid hourly replenishment and absorption, then it's not really required. So if we get into I should have had here grams per kilo versus percentage of calories as the next point under science. So do you want to just talk us through that, Andy?
Yeah, I think basically the grams per kilo is pretty well established for carb loading. It's between 8 and 12 grams per kilo of body weight. And that's per day in the last day or two. So if you're going to go, 48 hours, then you do between 8 and 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilo of body weight per day on the day before, on the day, the 2 days prior and the day prior. So when you, as I keep saying, when you lay that amount of food out, it's a shocking amount of carbohydrate for most people. And to your point about the percentage of total calories, it's going to be a significant proportion. I don't know exactly. Everyone will have different views on how much other fat, protein, fiber and stuff they're going to remove from their diet at that point, but it's going to be well over 70% of the calories. It might even be like 80% of the calories for some people.
Well, and I think absolutely you bang on with the grams per kilo. The point I often make to athletes about the percentage, and this is where some of the research has found that if you base it on percentage of calories, i.e., even if you get up to 60, 70% of, especially for females, where they may only be taking in, say, 2,200 calories or 2,500 calories, that 70% of that as carbohydrates won't equate to the 8 grams per kilo of body weight. So for a female in particular, and this is the research, is that you certainly push above or at least to 8 grams per kilo of body weight, and don't base it on percentage of your daily caloric intake, because what will tend to happen is just because you're not eating enough calories a lot of the time, you just won't hit that number. So I think that's where it really becomes very important for people to use the grams per kilo as opposed to percentage of daily caloric intake. And the male, female, I mean, are you seeing many differences in the way you approach this with female and male athletes, Andy?
Not massively, really. We're just looking at, there is an argument that if you took the average male athlete would have a slightly higher percentage of muscle mass more higher lean body mass than a female athlete, then you might advocate for slightly more carbohydrate as a result of that, because some of the earlier carbohydrate loading protocols were based on lean body mass rather than total body mass. But to be honest with you, we don't tend to draw huge distinctions between it's really, like you said, it's about hitting that minimum 8 grams per kilo of body weight, and that's the big lever to pull here. If we're getting into the weeds of other differences, I think they're fairly minor.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's often just getting the women to hit the amount that hopefully the men are hitting, and it seems to be that women potentially need a little bit more than the men. There is some studies showing that men maybe don't need to go as high as the 8, but I think just to keep things nice and simple and on parity, you just say, look, at least 8 grams per kilo body weight, whether you're a male or female. And again, from my experience, I don't think there's an age limit on this. I don't tend to put, like, if you're postmenopausal or an older male, I'm not putting restrictions on that based on age. Do you tend to do anything like that?
No, because I think really, as long as you're, going back to the drawbacks, as long as you don't make yourself sick, as long as you don't feeling bloated and sluggish to a point that is going to compromise your performance in the race, then to a degree, more is better with this.
Yeah.
Always caveat that statement with you have to be careful when you say to any athlete that more of something is better, but this is more athletes will probably underdo their carbohydrate intake in a carb load than overdo it.
Yeah. So if we get into the practical, and I didn't put this point on there, but let's touch on that now. Like you just mentioned, like laying it out and looking at it and practicing it. Do you recommend athletes actually practice their carbohydrate load leading into, towards a race or a major event?
It's a good idea. It varies. If you're an athlete that either races very regularly or you have a lot of years of experience behind you, then maybe it's not necessary to carb load before any training sessions. But most athletes, when the endurance athletes who are building up for a really big event, will have one or two big simulation type training sessions. And it is a good idea, I think, to at least you might not hit the really high notes of the same carb load that you do on race day, but getting somewhere close to that just to test it out. And certainly if you've not got years of experience or haven't got loads of races behind you, it's worth testing it out just to see how your body feels on that, because you've got another point there under the science around timings. And some people just have that kind of iron stomach and can eat lots and lots they can eat 3 big meals. They can take their normal 3-meal structure and boost it up and be fine with that. Other athletes have to change the timings to sort of far more of a grazing type approach, because you've got to eat so much volume, or they've got to change it up into sort of liquids or rather than solids or whatever to fit it in. So like with anything, you're going to practice it, or you're going to want to practice it a bit, so that you can be sure that it's going to work for you in the way that's intended.
Yeah, I agree. I certainly recommend to athletes who haven't had experience in carbohydrate loading. And that does include professionals and very good age groupers who think that they've done it and then they realize they've never done it. They've never done it properly. And it's a bit of a shock to the system and things, as you said, just that feeling of fullness, that sort of, geez, this is a lot of food and how am I going to get this in? And looking at the types of foods that they actually can stomach and deciding, okay, I can eat lots of white bread, I can eat bagels. I don't go well with that type of food and so on. So I think I certainly believe that it is worth practicing if you're not a seasoned campaigner in doing this. In terms of fat and protein, what do you tend to recommend across that week leading in? Do you tend to taper that with the athletes?
I think generally keeping it fairly normal until you start the loading phase, but then radically reducing the amount of fat and protein, really, because essentially you have to if you're going to get that, especially if you were going for more like the 10 or 12 grams per kilo. 8 grams per kilo, that's a lot of carbs, but 12 is a huge amount. And if you do that, you sort of find that the other macronutrients and fiber as well, I would kind of add into that, get squeezed. You have to squeeze them out a bit, because otherwise you end up with either too many total calories or just a very, very unpleasant feeling around trying to consume that amount of volume of food. Your body's pretty sensitive to that. So generally reducing those down, it's a bit of it does depend on what type of diet you normally follow. Some people find it easier. Other people will eat a very high protein, high fibrous diet regularly, and switching immediately to all processed, refined carbohydrates that might make them feel quite lousy, in which case tapering it in a little bit might help. Yeah. But it depends how representative the carbo load is of your general sort of training diet, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think we certainly advocate, starting to reduce that fat. We tend to keep protein, again, try and keep things consistent where possible, especially for the long course athletes. I think from my experience, just having some protein on board, not going overboard with it, but certainly keeping that and just keep some consistency there. We do advocate that. But I think the point about the fiber, certainly, and we'll start to talk about that athlete reducing total fiber intake from even the Monday before the race. And it is hard, especially with those high amounts of carbohydrate, even if you're eating processed foods, to keep fiber down below, 15 grams per day, 10 to 15 grams per day is tough, but it is possible through the choice of those, ultra processed and processed carbohydrate sources. You mentioned, I know you want to talk about like things like if someone does get a nervous stomach with this, either during the load or even just before the race, what are your recommendations?
I think if you know that you're a nervous eater on the morning of the race, then you've really got to make sure that you do a solid load on the 2 days prior, because that might restrict what you can take in and top up on race morning. And whilst in the long run you'd want to address that part of it, I think, and try to eat more on the morning, that's kind of not helpful advice in the short term. So I would say, focus on the loading prior if you've got a nervous stomach. Also, it's okay to include more liquid calories, sports drinks or juices and those kind of things that have a high carbohydrate content. They still count, and they still contribute to the total, so you might find those easier to get down. And then definitely, if you've got a nervous stomach, that's you are probably someone who's got to practice with what you're doing. So even if that means if we're talking about triathletes, because I'm sure a lot of people that are interested in this will be doing triathlon, a lot of swim sessions start early in the morning. And whilst you might not have the nerves that you've got pre-race, sometimes practicing eating before your morning swim sessions, if they're early, can be a good simulation and can help you figure out the types of foods that might go down a bit easier for you on race day, so that you can have it pre-planned, and get as much down you as you can.
Yeah, I think that practicing on that race day meal as well, I think that can be practiced as part of the carbohydrate load, but also just practiced on those days when you've got your big sessions. So your big bricks, if that's a Saturday or Sunday, replicate what you're going to be eating on race day before those sessions. And I think that does help with settling a nervous stomach and improving that. And your point about using liquid carbohydrates in the load, absolutely. Low fiber content, high carbohydrate content, not as it's, in terms of density, you're going to get a lot of calories per meal. So it tends to work very well in terms of getting that total amount of carbohydrate in. And then if we just go lastly, Andy, pre-start, a part of this carbohydrate load, what's your recommendation with athletes, pre-start of a race?
The window on that, when you read the literature on it, the window is pretty large. It suggests that sort of 1 to 4 hours before the start is kind of the window for the last pre-race meal, so breakfast in most cases, and then that should contain 1 to 4 grams of carbohydrate per kilo body weight. So maybe as little as half or even an eighth of what you would take in per kilo body weight in the day prior. And I think that's when you compare the extremes there. If you were to take, you probably aren't going to take 4 grams of carb per kilo body weight 1 hour before the start, and you're likely to want more than 1 gram per kilo 4 hours out. So it's kind of blending those two and figuring out. I would always start, I think, with both practically and sort of mentally, when you think what is your time frame of eating before the start, because different races obviously have different constraints. If you've got travel involved in the morning of the race and a lot of waiting around, you might be eating that last meal 3 or 4 hours before. But if you have the opportunity and think you can stomach it, you might be able to pull that last meal up to 90 minutes to 2 hours before, and consequently I'd be grazing up to that if it was 90 minutes or 2 hours before, and having a smaller meal, 1 or 2 grams per kilo body weight. Or if I'm eating a lot way out from the race, 4 hours out, then I would load it up closer towards the 3 or 4 grams per kilo. That though, more than the carbo load itself, obviously, because it's that much closer to the start of the race, is definitely the bit that needs some practice and needs some experience to handle. Because if you balls up your carbohydrate intake 2 days out from the race, that might not be catastrophic for the race. But if you really do screw up your intake 90 minutes to 2 hours before, either by taking too much and feeling sick and bloated, or taking not enough and not giving yourself enough energy, both of those outcomes aren't going to help you race. So nailing that bit with a bit of practice is really, really important.
Yeah, I tend to talk about, I think, look, what the average athlete's somewhere between 50 and 80 kilos. So I tend to say, look, if you're on the lower end of the weight scale, somewhere around 100 grams of carbs for that meal in the morning, up to say 150, 160 grams if you're at the higher end. So yeah, somewhere in that 100 to 150 grams of carbs in that meal on race day is going to be fairly suffice in terms of that range of grams per kilo. And sometimes that simplifies it for the athlete. But I think to your point, eating a long way out, I think from the race, 2 or 3 hours makes sense, just to let everything settle. If you've got to go to the toilet, all that, get it through. What about like just, where's your last feed before the race starts? Where do you tend to put that?
Yeah, for me and for a lot of athletes that we work with, we try a gel or a decent amount of sports drink about 15 minutes before the start. So that the idea with that is that a gel or a sports drink will take about 15 minutes to be digested and hit the bloodstream, at which point when the gun goes off, even if it's a long race, there is a surge of adrenaline, there's a spike in glucose uptake and all that sort of stuff. So having a little bit of a boost at that point is often not a bad thing. It spares glycogen or glucose that would come from elsewhere. You've got an extra boost of energy in. The danger is if there are a few athletes that suffer this kind of rebound hypoglycemia where your blood sugar drops because you take the sugar in and insulin and is being released to combat that, plus muscles are scavenging glucose from the bloodstream as the race starts. And some people find that they kind of dip and feel quite lightheaded and low blood sugar for a few, it can last for a few minutes. Or the literature doesn't sort of suggest that it's a major problem for a majority of people, but again, it's one of those things that you've got to test out, and if in doubt, if you don't think it works for you, then walk away from it. But I would say a lot of athletes could benefit. If you're doing an Ironman, I would be trying to take something 15 minutes out from the start just to give myself that final little carbohydrate boost.
Yeah, agree. The easiest way to practice it is just before some of your swim sessions, 10 to 15 minutes before you're about to start your swim, have a gel or some blocks or some carbohydrate liquid. Do it a few times, make sure you feel good in the pool. You don't get that drop or you don't feel faint, and you're good to go. So, from a practical standpoint, I think it's easy to practice and certainly advantageous from practical experience working with athletes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we can probably skip past this, but what I want to talk about was, because we talk about carbohydrate, then we talk about practicalities, Andy, and it's something that we've talked about a lot in terms of, athletes practicing what we at Fuelin term carbohydrate capacity. And I think, yes, we talked about carbohydrate loading there and practicing that, but I think in terms of practicing carbohydrate intake during training is also super important to see what the effect of the carbohydrate loading is combined with in-session fueling. In terms of, if you were to give a 30,000 foot overview of how you tend to structure carbohydrate intake for athletes during sessions, how would you structure that, or how would you term it?
I'd say for any hard long training sessions, which obviously is a bit of a vague term, but it covers any sessions where you might realistically be able to say that that carbohydrate or reduce sort of lack of carbohydrates could influence your performance. So if you're going out for 90 minutes, 2 hours plus, and you're going quite hard, then we would be advising athletes to fuel those sessions and fuel them relatively aggressively, which probably means at least 30 to 60 if it's on the shorter end of that spectrum, and more often 60 to 90, or if they're very fast and going for a very long time, 90 plus grams of carbohydrate an hour, which is very similar to what we'd recommend in races. So that has the advantage of obviously getting your gut trained up to handle that type and amount of carbohydrate for when race day comes. And it also improves your performance in that session and recovery from that session. So it's kind of picking at least a couple of sessions a week, really, in the immediate build up to a race, and fueling them in a race-like way is not a bad idea at all.
Yeah, I all I know from practical experience working with athletes, whether they're, beginners, seasoned age groupers, or professional athletes, is that the more that they consume higher amounts of carbohydrates during those higher intensity, appropriate longer duration sessions, the better the outcome in terms of the practical experience for doing it on the bike or on the run, in terms of how the performance of the actual session goes. And then the inadvertent thing that I think most athletes report is just how much better they feel after the session and the recovery from that session. And so I think if you get that carbohydrate intake correct within the appropriate sessions, it is a bit of a game changer for a lot of athletes, and not waiting until like the race comes around before thinking, shit, what am I eating now? What am I going to be doing? Like, the really strong advice would be get the products that you plan on using in races and practice with them. So if that's your PF30 drink mix with, PF30 gels and their chews, and that's what you're going to be using, then practice it. And then practice what you're going to be using with on the bike, on the run as well. So practice those brick sessions. More often than not, triathletes will get GI complaints with the run off the bike. And so it's important to know what products affect you or how you cope with them on the bike, but then how they also translate to performance on the run.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, we've been working with triathletes and cyclists and ultra runners for quite a few years now. With the professional cyclists, we're working with the Lotto Destiny team this year, and what talking to them has opened our eyes to is how much cycling has changed in the last few years, away from using, say, gels to fuel their races, but training on energy bars and bananas and things like that. Now I know, because of the amount of gels that we're supplying to the team, that they are using them every single day in training. They're using them to fuel all of their sessions, because they've figured out that actually, that, as you were saying, that practice of exactly what they're going to do on race day is critical in training if they're going to get the best out of those sessions, but then also have no worries about translating that into race performance. So specificity of the practice is really, really important.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll get into hydration. I know things are ticking along. So if we talk about, in terms of euhydration or being well hydrated, where do you sit with that versus, say, hyperhydration and hyperhydration in terms of, let's talk about like just athletic performance, Andy?
Most of the time, I think it depends who you talk to and what you read, but you can get opinions that athletes do fine with their hydration most of the time, left to their own devices. So they're mostly euhydrated. There are studies out there that suggest that high percentage of athletes turn up to most of their training sessions hypohydrated or a bit dehydrated. So I think it's difficult to get a real handle on. It's certainly an individual, it's going to be an individual thing, but I think euhydration, normal, as in normal bodily hydration, is what we're shooting for the vast majority of the time. There's going to be a natural flex in that up and down if your training load is pretty high, because you are going to become temporarily dehydrated during sessions and have to rehydrate afterwards. But in order to monitor euhydration or hydration status in general, the recommendation we make to athletes that are in serious training is really simple. It's to kind of weigh themselves in most mornings and just look for any major spikes or drops in body weight that happen day to day. Obviously, as you're training, you might be trending upwards in weight if that's the aim, or if you're trying to gain muscle and that sort of thing, or you might be trending downwards in weight if you're trying to get leaner and lighter. But what it will tend to be is a relatively smooth trend line if everything else is in sync. If you see big spikes in day-to-day hydration status, then day-to-day body weight when you wake up in the morning, it's likely to be to do with shifts in body fluid. And so I would say using body weight as a marker to maintaining euhydration is probably the most practical kind of tip to give to people. Yeah. And that, if you just keep a basic log of that, you'll learn a lot about your hydration habits very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think it's funny, isn't it? Because I often get asked the question, they're like, oh, how do I do a sweat test? And it's like, well, are you talking about a sweat sodium test where, you use a company like yourself who does provide the sweat sodium concentration? Or, yeah, as you suggest, a sweat rate test is weighing yourself before and after a session and then recording the fluids that you drink and working out your sweat rate. And I think further to that, what you're suggesting there, like, getting an understanding by weighing yourself on a daily basis, or at least before and after sessions, to understand how much fluid you're losing is often it's a real insightful way of getting control of your hydration status. Like, for myself, I've started training for this 70.3. Like, I am a heavy sweater. Like, I can lose, up to 2 liters per hour if it's hot and I'm running fast. Like, so I'm very aware now of my need to rehydrate and actually get my fluids right, including sodium, because I feel, again, I've been tested by you. You've given me a number. I shoot a little bit below that, but that's certainly helping me feel hydrated, maintain my hydration status. But if I wasn't weighing myself regularly before and after sessions and keeping a log of that, I wouldn't have a clear understanding of what my hydration status is. And it takes time. And I think, to your point, Andy, like, it does take repeated efforts to understand how much fluid you lose. Like, one session isn't going to give you like, oh, okay, I lose 1.2 liters per hour and that's it. Like, there's going to be fluctuations based on intensity, based on the type of exercise, based on the temperature of the environment. But I think, as you say, those repeated measurements are so invaluable for athletes to gain a really good understanding of themselves.
Definitely. And I think if you find that you're someone who weighs in regularly each morning or most mornings, and find that your morning resting body weight is fairly stable most of the time, then whatever you're currently doing is probably a pretty decent, you're taking good care of your hydration, whether you're doing it proactively or not. You only really need to start to worry about doing something a little bit more proactive if you see bigger fluctuations in it. And that might be a change in training load, or it might be a change in climate, or that sort of thing. So this might not matter if you're in Florida and it's in the winter. It's probably quite pleasant for training, but in the summer, all of a sudden, if you're not keeping a handle on this and you're going out doing some big sessions in 95 Fahrenheit and 88% humidity, then it doesn't take too many days to dig yourself a bit of a hole of dehydration. And you might not notice that in how you feel initially, but it might show up on the scales first. So, and then what you can do is you can start to play around with these other things that, that we're talking about for pre-exercise hydration, like the sodium intake, the volume of water, relation to that, even glycerol to pre-hydrate before sessions, before races. And also with sodium, that's a big one for using post-exercise as well, so that you regain fluid balance more quickly. Because if you want to get up and train hard again the next day, you'll retain a lot more of the fluid that you drink if you add sufficient sodium to it.
So let's touch on that. And I know you guys released an article which touched on some of the research by Alan McCubbin and his group about sodium intake, habitual sodium intake, and whether higher amounts of sodium in your daily diet can impact fluid balance and osmolarity and whatnot. Do you want to just touch on that? So in terms of should athletes or what happens if athletes take on more sodium in their diet or reduce sodium in their diet in the days leading up to racing?
I think if you do it acutely in the days leading up to races, you can start to hyperhydrate a little bit, because more sodium in the body tends to retain more fluid with it, because that ratio of sodium to fluid is important for the body's homeostasis. So if you take in a bit of additional sodium, then you will tend to store some additional water in the same way. It's not the same mechanism, but it's like when you carbohydrate load, you take in more carbs and that stores water with it, you're taking more sodium. And when your body sodium stores start to get a little bit maxed out, you'll tend to hold on to more fluid as well. So acutely in the days leading up to a race, while we don't recommend people do anything particularly special until the last few hours, I think adding a little bit of salt to your food or having some electrolyte tablets in the water you drink is not a bad idea, because it'll help you to balance that. I think habitually over or chronically over a long period of time, your body is wise to, you know, fluctuations in sodium and fluid intake, and tends to bring you back as much as it possibly can to a euhydrated state by making you pee more and putting more or less sodium, filtering more sodium into that urine, so that essentially it balances itself out.
So my understanding from that article was that most of the research was showing stupid amounts of sodium being ingested and what the effect was on osmolarity of the blood. But even with those super high intakes, which was probably unrealistic in the real world, the actual shift in osmolarity was potentially not even of practical importance. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was basically homeostasis is very powerful around this, and it balances it out, because your kidneys take control of sodium balance in the body. You know, part of the article was also looking at the effect, say, of increasing sodium intake on sweat sodium losses, because that's a question we get asked a lot around our sweat test. Surely the sweat test, if I eat more salt, I'll sweat more salt out. It's not really the case. You know, you might, at the extremes, you might sweat a little bit more out if you take on a lot of sodium chronically, or you might be able to reduce your sweat sodium if you completely abstain from taking sodium in. But generally speaking, most of the time it's going to be your kidneys, and the osmolality of your plasma is going to be maintained, because that's critical for homeostasis, and your kidneys are going to kick out any excess sodium, or they're going to retain sodium if you're not taking enough in.
Yeah. Okay. And that's, I think that was the point, wasn't it? Like, okay, if you're taking in, I can't remember what the amounts were. Was it something like 6 grams or 9 grams of salt or something like that per day? But it only bumped up that sweat sodium concentration minimally, and it was just unreal. It wasn't real world. So, you know, to your point, the marker that you provide, you know, is going to be fairly consistent regardless of what the individual athlete is consuming on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, we've had numerous people come to us and have a sweat test and sort of challenge this idea by then going away and eating a lot of salty food or taking lots of electrolyte supplements, and coming back and being surprised that their sweat test is basically identical.
Yeah,
if we'd have tested their urine, it would be a different story. But in terms of sweat losses in exercise, then it's going to be reasonably ballpark similar to what it was.
Okay, so in terms of sodium, like again, in conjunction with the carbohydrate load, what is your recommendation? Is it based on, obviously the idea would be you'd be doing a sweat sodium test, and then basing the amount of sodium that they should be ingesting the days before based on that? Is that how you do it? Or if someone doesn't have access to the test, what would be your sodium recommendation leading into an event?
Yeah, I think honestly, the sodium recommendations leading into an event don't need to take too much into account regarding someone's sodium losses. That's more to do with during exercise replacement. In the lead up to a race, everyone can probably benefit from taking in some additional sodium. And what that is, there's obviously a limit. Like with carbohydrates, there's a limit to how much you can store in the body. It's not as elastic as the limit for carbs. The limit for sodium will be much more tightly controlled, but you can walk around a bit sodium depleted, and by adding extra salt to your food in the final few days before a race, you're going to totally ensure that you're not depleted, so that your sodium stores in various tissues in the body and in your blood are fully topped up. And what you'll find is that taking in a bit of extra sodium and salting your food in the last few days will make sure you're definitely, it keeps your thirst drive active, you know, so you will also naturally drink enough water. So I think water and sodium in the last few days, it's like salting your food or eating saltier foods, and just drinking water in response to that, you know, and keeping well hydrated. What we do recommend very specifically in the last few hours before either a very long event or an event in the heat, or if you're someone who's a big sweater, is to have somewhere between sort of 500 mil and 750 mil, so about 16 to 24 ounces of a very strong electrolyte drink. With the strongest one that we make, if you mix it up as directed, is it has 1500 milligrams of sodium a litre, and that's kind of the lowest end of what's strong enough to boost your blood volume a little bit. So having that in the final 90 minutes before the start of a race is a really good idea to make sure that your tanks are fully topped up. But there's no point in starting that like a carb load 2 or 3 days before, because your body will just correct and just pee it out.
Okay, so week before, just stay as an athlete, stay as what you'd normally do with your sodium intake, habitual sort of nutrition and that. Day before is what I'm hearing. You would start to take in, say, that increased in amount of sodium. So in your case, you're probably recommending somewhere between that, 750 milligrams, 1000 milligrams extra sodium the day before?
No, so I think, so the extra sodium, I think you can start adding sodium like with the carbo load a couple of days out. So you can
so 48 to 24 hours out. Okay.
And then the most important specific additional sodium preload is literally about 90 minutes before the start. So that is about
on the day of the event.
Yeah, on the day of the event, like 16 ounces or so of fluid, depending on your body size. It might be a little bit less than that if you're small individual. If you're really big, you might go for 24 ounces, but it's basically a very strong electrolyte solution. So like pH 1500. You might also, I've often done that. I lose a lot of salt. I'm a big sweater. If it's before a long hot event, I might also do that the night before as well. But the one that you take in about an hour to 90 minutes before is the most important one, because that's the one that's going to go into your system. You're going to absorb it. It boosts your blood volume, and then it's that blood volume is boosted for the start of the race. You've got time to have a pee if you need it, but you've got extra plasma on board so that you're starting with your sort of tanks fully topped up.
Okay, so you'd probably be, if depending on your carbohydrate intake on race day, if you're consuming that around 3 hours before, you'd be having your meal, doing that. Then about 90 minutes before the start of the race, ingesting this, what did you say, about 700 mils of the electrolyte, which I presume if it's the sachet, it would have some carbohydrate in it as well. So it would have about 17, 18 grams of carbs. So again, topping up a little bit more. That's about 90 minutes before, and then about 10 to 15 minutes before the start of the race, topping up once again with, say, a 30-gram gel, plus or minus caffeine, depending. And we probably won't get into the caffeine, but I'd probably say have some caffeine at that point in time as well before you go, and get you going. But I think that's really useful information for an athlete to take away from this, and obviously can reach out to you to find out, or to both of us to find out more about that. I think this infographic really just sums up, what we've talked about. Now, in terms of carbohydrate loading, increased muscle output, as Andy highlighted, the more glycogen you've got, the more energy, the more power, the more speed. And it's pretty simple in terms of that. So I think we see through the literature, carbohydrate loading has improved time trial performance, time to exhaustion as well. I put in things about improved bone mineral markers, and this is just something more related to carbohydrate intake in general that I think is something that's super interesting to me, and certainly should be of interest to a lot of athletes, female athletes in particular, but also male athletes, that carbohydrate consumption, certainly after training, is going to improve bone mineral markers. And that's really important from a health perspective. So you will improve osteoblastic activity and reduce this osteoclastic activity, which again, don't skimp on carbs, because from a health perspective, and if you've got issues with bones, then carbohydrates can be very advantageous to improving bone health. Improved energy balance. Overall, it's a pretty simple equation, isn't it, Andy, with physics? if you need more energy, you need to eat more, and carbohydrates is one of those macronutrients that can certainly be consumed in fairly high volumes and allow for that energy balance to be better. And then, as we highlighted as well, improved recovery. I think one of the number one things that I hear from athletes when they start consuming more carbohydrates, certainly before and during sessions, is that their recovery post-session is massively improved. And then the only other thing I want to touch on, like in terms of reduced risk of injury, in terms of hydration, in terms of fueling, where do you sit on that? Do you believe that it can help with reduced risk of injury? Are you still on the fence with that?
I think I think my instincts tell me that, fueling and hydration are important in reducing the risk of injury, and that if you are competing or training and you are not meeting your calorie needs, you're not meeting your carbohydrate needs, you are either dehydrated or depleted in electrolytes. We know all of those things kind of put homeostasis severely out of whack, put more stress on the body, and ultimately more stress is probably going to lead to more injury. I think it's hard to draw a straight line between those two things. And I had a very interesting discussion just a couple of days ago with a rugby coach in the UK, or a physio who's working with rugby players, who's had a spate of injuries or muscle issues with athletes. A lot of the athletes have got into the idea of using saunas, and he's been taking notes and sort of feels like it's a lot of the guys that are using saunas a lot, sweating a lot. He feels like they're turning up to training relatively dehydrated and then suffering muscle strains and pulls to a much greater frequency than they were otherwise seeing. So we had quite an interesting discussion about the role of hydration and electrolyte balance and how that might be, because there are plenty of rational reasons or logical reasons why being dehydrated, having low cellular volume, having low electrolyte levels might affect the way that muscles function. But I think that the research is thin on the ground with that, so it's hard to draw any big conclusions. But certainly it's not going to help you being deficient in any of those key areas.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, how one area of health, something like saunas, which obviously a lot of people are talking about, and you got to put in context though. Are you talking about trying to extend lifespan, or are you talking about trying to play a collision sport? And what's more important in terms of getting that right, in terms of ensuring proper hydration status and whatnot? I think in terms of risk of injury, certainly if you're an athlete who's suffering from bone stress injuries, frequent injuries like that, muscle injuries, tendon injuries, then probably that energy balance on the far left is probably out of whack. And we know that if an athlete is in low energy availability, and that could be from unconscious underfueling by excluding something like a macronutrient like carbohydrates. So that unconscious underfueling through exclusion of a certain macro type or a food type, say gluten, could lead to underfueling, a caloric deficit, and that therefore could result in increased risk of injury as well. So just something for athletes to think about in that sense. I think we touched on a lot of this from a sweat rate test perspective, and that difference between sweat rate testing and sweat sodium testing. But I just wanted to highlight here, it is so important, as Andy said, to get an understanding of what your sweat rate is. Understanding how much you sweat in, if you just break it down, less than 30 degrees Celsius or over 30 degrees Celsius, or less than 85 Fahrenheit, greater than 85 Fahrenheit, over set durations, bike run, brick specific, what's your fluid loss, what's your fluid intake, understanding what your percentage of body weight loss is. Andy, do you read about 2% body weight loss? Do you tend to try and keep athletes below that, or are you a little bit allow them to go a bit above, knowing that in reality in races they go well above that?
I think certainly for ultra endurance, there's lots of information to suggest that athletes finish races significantly more dehydrated than that without a performance decrement. But the question often is what's suitable for a race when you can finish, and you want to effectively finish close to the point where your performance is going to drop off a cliff and recovery might take a long time, versus what you might want to do in training, are two different things. Because staying within 2 or 3% body weight loss during a lot of key training sessions might be sensible for continuity and consistency of training, but those numbers are a little bit individual. Some athletes appear to be able to tolerate big swings in their hydration status, and other athletes appear to be more sensitive to it. One of the biggest problems with general recommendations in this area is that obviously percentage body weight loss has a lot to do with the level of fluid and the body weight you had to start with. So if you're fully carbohydrate loaded with lots of extra fluid on board and you've sodium loaded, I definitely used to start an Ironman 2 kilos or more heavier than my average day-to-day weight in that immediate build-up, which is basically carbs and fluid. And so at that point, I could have probably dropped 2 kilos without actually becoming substantially dehydrated at all. And so you've got it. That's why the only quick answer to this is like, go and collect a load of data on yourself and look at things like how you perform, how you recover, how you feel at different levels of loss, and you'll soon start to zone in on what are red flags for you, basically.
Yeah, I think the last point there, be the scientist. You've got to be your own N=1 and experiment on yourself, so you understand, when you are hyperhydrated and you do lose fluid, but it doesn't impact, your performance, then that could be a strategy that you could take into racing, and certainly and utilize that to improve performance on race day. Just wanted to touch on Fuelin and how we work. So we do work with companies like Dandy and big fans of their products, because what we see with athletes is that athletes using them on a day-to-day basis, or certainly on a weekly basis, do have improvements in outcomes. So what we are is, a training-based nutrition app platform that syncs with the training program, as I mentioned. So whether you're on Training Peaks, Today's Plan, or Final Surge, we've got you covered. So, it works in 3 simple steps. You download Fuelin, you sync it with your training plan, and then it's about training, eating, and recovering. And that's probably, the simplest way of thinking about this. It's about adherence and it's about consistency. And throughout that journey, you're constantly measuring and putting data into the Fuelin app to provide more feedback to you. So sweat rates, carbohydrate capacity, body weight goals, and body weight monitoring are some of the simple ways that you can do that. You can also track using things like MyFitnessPal or Lose It. So if you want to track your macros specifically, you can do that, or you can do that within Fuelin. And then I think the thing that we love about it most is the community aspect. So diving in with guys like Andy and his company, Precision Hydration and Fuel, educating athletes with, people we mentioned, Dr. Alan McCubbin, having him on talking about the science of hydration and sodium. I think it's always really wonderful for athletes to be learning more about the why they're doing stuff, as well as the how and what to do. So I think it's certainly a wonderful tool for athletes if you are serious about your nutrition and dialing it in, and especially for long course. I personally don't know how anyone does it without some structure. I think about it in the way that, my coach gives me structured training and Fuelin gives structured nutrition. And without that, I honestly don't know how athletes get through the training. And then I just wanted to give a little bit of a plug to Andy. And Andy, do you want to mention anything in particular about these products that you want to highlight?
No, I think the only just quick thing to say about them is, thanks for your sort of kind words about the products. We just strive to make very simple, effective products that make it easy for athletes to hit their Fuelin numbers with, because it always surprised us prior to our products coming out that you had to read the small print on the back of a gel that was designed to give you carbohydrate to find out how much carbohydrate was in it. And so really, there's nothing magic in what we do here, but it is just a case of helping you work out your numbers, 30, 60, 90, maybe even 120 grams of carb an hour, and then giving you the different product options to hit those. So We also, like you, Scott, spend a lot of time, working with and consulting with athletes, less actually on the full package, obviously, around day-to-day nutrition. That's not our specialism. What we're mainly aiming at is that during exercise window. So if people listening to this want to hit us up and talk about specific questions they have for that, then we have free call booking links on the website, and you can just email the team as well and get yourself booked in for one of those.
Yeah, I think it's a great service, Andy. And I think, the combination of that education around the in-session fueling and then, that day-to-day nutrition and how they interlink, I think it's so crucial for athletes. I love the 90-gram packet. And I've been talking to a lot of athletes about this. It's perfect for the run. You don't have to faff around. The only thing I get wrong is I probably squeeze about half of it in my mouth in the first go. So I usually carry, that and a couple of the single gels. And the fact that you've now released your 30-gram gel with 100 milligrams of caffeine, it's probably, for me, it's carrying the 90-gram pouch and then 2 30-gram caffeinated gels, and that will get me through the half, which is nice. So we're aiming somewhere around that 60 or 70 grams an hour.
Cool.
So I think, the key takeaways from this: carbohydrate loading. I think, as we said, the science has changed a lot from the 1950s to the week before with glycogen depletion and all that. You don't need to do that. Somewhere between 24 to 48 hours is required. Sorry about the spelling mistake there. Certainly that 8 gram per kilo body weight, male, female, no matter what your age, that's what you need to be targeting. And it is, as Andy said, it's a lot of food. If you're a heavier athlete, it is a hell of a lot of food. If you're a small athlete, it's quite daunting even just seeing the amount of food as well. So it's all relative to you. But certainly you need to practice it and you need to explore the foods that will allow you to get there. Andy, do you want to add anything to that, those 3 points?
No, I think that covers it. It's a lot of food and practice eating it.
Yeah. And then in terms of hydration, I think, look, it's fairly similar to the carbohydrate load in that you just got to understand what your requirements are as well. So, as Andy touched on, understand what your fluid loss is day to day. If that's weighing yourself, it's not to monitor your body weight. Okay. You're not tracking, like, are you going down in terms of the trend? That's more related to, weight and what you're doing with energy balance, but you're just tracking fluid balance based on training. And then I think something like, if you do have access to a sweat sodium test to get an indication of that amount of sodium in your sweat, then I think it's very worthwhile, and that can provide you with a marker to then start to build out your hydration strategy and certainly your sodium intake strategy. Hydration and rehydration is certainly very individual and personalized. And the more that you become involved in this and utilizing, testing before and after sessions, understanding fluid balance, the better you'll be at maintaining a hydrated state. And similar to carbohydrate loading, I think you got to practice it. The best athletes, whether it's a pro athlete that I'm working with, or great age group athletes, or beginners who are just really involved in this, they've got hundreds of data points in the Fuelin app to show them where they sit as an average for those differing temperatures for those different types of sessions. And so the more data that's collected, the better you'll get, the better your understanding of what your personal requirements will be. And just wanted to highlight, lovely of Precision to be giving away $100 worth of their stuff. I'll be trying to jump in on this. It's probably a bit odd if I win it though. But the products are great. So look, there's an opportunity. It's on Instagram at the moment. Tag some friends. Got to be in it to win it. So win $100 of fuel from Precision and a month of daily nutrition coaching from Fuelin. So we're excited about this. And I think it's running for a few weeks, and then we'll announce the winner on social media. And then this is how you can get in contact. So obviously precisionhydration.com is Andy's website. Ours is fuelin.com. And you can reach out to us either at hello or info at those two email addresses. And for anyone who is with, listening to this, you can use a Precision 20 code, and that will give you 20% off the pilot, autopilot, or co-pilot tiered Fuelin Nutrition programs that we have available on our website. Andy, do you have anything you want to add to that? I think thank you so much. It's always insightful to hear how you guys are approaching hydration and fueling with your athletes. That I know you work with a lot of them, and it's really great. And as I said, I think your product is fantastic. It's simple, right? And that's the best thing about it. Like, you got rid of a lot of the BS and just stripped it down to what's actually required. So thank you for simplifying a lot of our athletes' lives with your product.
No, it's all good. Thanks, Scott, and thanks for the invite to come on and talk about this. I think getting your carbohydrate loading and pre-hydration right are relatively, as they go, once you get practicing with them, relatively simple things to get right, but things that can have a really big impact on your performance. So certainly, people get lost in the weeds of lots of other more complicated nutrition and hydration topics, but if you can turn up to a race fully fueled and optimally hydrated, then you set yourself up for the best chance of success, really.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thanks, Andy. I know it's late for you. We'll sign off there, and have a good evening.
Thanks, mate. Have a good day.
Perfect.
Thanks, good.
Thanks, mate.
Bye.
James, do you have any questions or anything? Oh, he's gone. Andy, do you have any questions?
Andy's
gone. That's good, mate. I think
Cool.
we'll just cut.